Content warning: Nazism, eugenics, and misogyny. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
Behold, I teach you the Superman. The Superman is the meaning of the earth. Have you ever cried thus? Ah, would that I had heard you crying thus. It is not your sin, it is your moderation that cries to heaven. Your very meanness in sinning cries to heaven. Where is the lightning to lick you with its tongue? Where is the madness that you should be cleansed? Behold, I teach you the Superman. He is that lightning. He is that madness. Thus spake Friedrich Nietzsche, in words that echoed down the century to come, words that prophesied the next stage of human evolution, at least in the popular imagination. With the rapid march of technology, people began to believe that science would reach beyond better technology, better medicine, better quality of life, and create a better human. It was an idea seized on by most of the visionaries of the 20th century, and it inspired dreams both idealistic and horrific, most especially in the mythology of the Nazis. But the people who stood against the Nazis also imagined a hero with impossible strength and speed, a man of tomorrow, as morally pure as he was physically perfect, and thus was born the superhero. But before Clark Kent, even before Doc Savage, the superhero had a trial run in a novel written by Philip Wylie. The book was called Gladiator. Hello, and welcome to What Mad Universe. As always, I'm Adam, and this is Phil.
Hello.
Hello. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting novel called Gladiator, and it's interesting because it is one of the bedrock texts for the superhero.
Yeah.
It probably influenced. We can have this debate later. It's a raging debate, but it almost, in my mind, it almost certainly influenced Joe Siegel and Joel Shuster to create Superman, if only indirectly. And in fact, it reads as almost a deconstruction of the superhero at a time before the superhero officially existed.
I was going to relate it to early zombie stories like Night of the Living Dead, which deconstructs a lot of the zombie survivalist narratives that came later.
That's right.
But it was the first.
Yeah, exactly. It's and I was saying, if we're speaking of horror, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if you watch it now, it kind of predates almost every slasher you can think of, and yet it's almost completely dismantling anything you would expect from a slasher movie. And Night of the Living Dead does the same thing for zombie movies. And yeah, it's another one of those essentially, because it is a story about a guy named Hugo Danner, whose father, Abednego Danner, is a brilliant scientist, and he discovers a way to basically inject the human muscle with its full potential, I guess you would say, via chemistry.
It compares it to an ant lifting several times its weight, and a grasshopper being able to leap really far.
Which, of course, makes everyone compare it to Spider-Man as well.
Yeah, but it was also the first Superman story explains his powers scientifically. Like, he can jump an eighth of a mile like a grasshopper can, proportionally, and all that.
Exactly.
And
yeah. And in this case, he's injected with... I chemicals, which again, that ties him to another character he almost certainly inspired, which is Captain America.
But he was injected as an embryo.
It was before he was born. This guy experimented on his unborn child because he's a nutcase. And interestingly enough, they don't really deny that in the book. They don't try to make this guy seem like an awesome dude for experimenting on his son. But anyway, he becomes super strong and super fast. He can jump, tall buildings with a single bound.
Well, there's actually here, I'll read something out here.
Okay.
I can do things, Dad. It kind of scares me. I can jump higher in a house. I can run faster in a train. I can pull up big trees and push them over. Not quite as evocative as faster than a speeding bullet, but it's getting there.
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's the kind of thing that Superman, especially Golden Age Superman, seems very similar to his power set, and Captain America again, because he had.
He's also virtually indestructible. Like bullets bounce off him,
right?
And he can leap really far. So, like you said, Golden Age Superman, where it was not but a bursting shell could pierce his skin.
Exactly, yes. And but what's interesting is that once he's gotten these abilities, what we then get is a coming-of-age novel in which he never really does anything heroic. It's literally just about...
A few times, but not really.
He does some heroic stuff, but it is not the novel of Superman. It's the novel of... just a guy. It's a coming of age, how a guy lived his life novel.
Yeah, and it screws up his life.
Yeah, he is very. It's a very downbeat novel.
Yes.
He's not. It's sort of it doesn't. It's the classic superhero's lament is isn't it suck to be a freak with these crazy powers? But he really doesn't. Manage to do anything with them, essentially. No. And that's part of the struggle of the novel is, well, now I have all the super strength. What can I do with it? Which is a little bit, I feel like the lady doth protest a bit too much because there are probably a lot of things he could have thought of to do. And near the end of the novel, he finally gets sort of inspired to do stuff.
But that's a little problematic, his plan at the end.
I'm not even talking about his plan at the end. I'm talking about just his dad telling him, you've got to go. And then he meets, he basically almost becomes a communist.
Yeah,
except
pretty much. They don't use the word outright, but...
They do, actually. I was looking for that. I was like, so you're kind of suggesting he's falling in with communists, and then they do full out say he's a communist, and then they say, oh no, we're better than the communists. But it's clearly tied to that intellectual tradition, right? But yes, it's full on like, what can I do to help person? And somehow he doesn't think of anything until near the end of the novel. Mm-hmm. And to be fair, I mean, he keeps getting things thrown in his path that make it hard. Every time he tries to do something right, life kind of whacks him upside the head, which is part of the point of the novel. He rescues at one point, he gets a job in a bank and he's doing okay. And then somebody gets stuck in a vault, so he has to rescue them. And instead of being grateful, the bank manager basically tortures him for hours, or tries to, because he can't, because he's invulnerable.
Because he thinks he's a safecracker who broke into the...
Yeah, he's like, this guy... It's almost not even that. It's almost like... well, you know how to get into my secure bank vault, so you've got to tell me how you did it so I can, because you could use that knowledge.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. But so the crooked cops, well, I guess just cops at the time, just tortured him, literally tortured him, like they were getting out a blowtorch at one point.
Yeah, and none of which really hurt him that much.
Yeah.
And finally he goes, enough of this, and he pounds them all silly and drags the guy out. Basically, he just dumps them off in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't really do that much to him.
Yeah.
And then there's and then at one point he saves his beloved from a bull, and she freaks out and never wants to see him again because he's so strong. And there's all kinds of stuff that happens to him that, anyway, it's sort of contrived so that he has a bad life.
But it almost hangs a lampshade on that as well at one point.
Right.
Where after he saves the woman from the bull, he starts complaining like, this is just silly at this point. Like everything just like whenever it looks like my life is going in slightly right direction, something dreadful happens and I have to show off my strength.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like Superman, if he didn't have the upbringing and the drive to be good, and he does full on say that, he's lacking in, he has all this strength, but he's lacking in spirit and imagination, because he has to have other people tell him, actually, there's tons of stuff you could do with this to make the world a better place. He's not necessarily saying he doesn't want to do heroic things and make the world a better place, but somehow he can't think of anything he could do to help the world until, again, he gets finally, when his dad's on his deathbed, he meets with him, and his dad's like, "Oh yeah, you could do all these great things," and that kind of inspires him for a bit. He does. Sorry, before that, he goes to war.
Yeah,
and he does play. This is World War One.
Yeah,
and he does play a major role in, knocking down the enemy forces and winning back victories.
Yeah, and he did. At the end of the war section of the novel, he was going to actually go into Berlin and shut the whole thing down, but then armistice is declared.
Right, yeah, exactly. He's on the verge of, you know what, I'm just going to end the war right now, just charge into Berlin and mow it flat, and then...
But the war comes after he tries high school football.
Right.
And it's sort of... It's interesting, because it is sort of... He is cheating, technically, because there's no chance he has of losing this thing.
Right.
So it's like he's on steroids, or even worse.
Right.
Like he's playing against children or something. And it mentions that this is sort of a Pyrrhic victory, and it loses its charm after a while.
Right.
And then he accidentally kills somebody on the field.
Right, which is the thing that kind of permanently drives him away from college, and he had friends in college. And part of the point of the novel is he never makes any real friends. They comment on it directly. But yeah, he had some friends in college, and that kind of makes him want to split and never see them again. They're weirdly casual about him killing a guy in football. They don't, everyone's just like, well, it happens in football. Like, how dangerous was football in the 1920s?
They didn't have helmets. They had leather helmets.
I know, but anyway, surely not that many people die. They're playing football.
Not. Particularly not college football.
I guess not, yeah. Anyway, but it is kind of, everyone just goes, oh, well, that guy died in the story, which was a bit...
He broke his neck in 3 places, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And the coach is one of the people who kind of learns that he's got some weird abilities. So, but yeah. Anyway, there's it's somebody compared it to imagine if Ernest Hemingway had written a superhero novel, where it's much more about his angst. He's very angsty. He's always talking about how horrible his life is, and I think the implication that Wylie, the author, is trying to suggest is just. That he's ahead of his time. He's a man mourned for the future that, the present isn't ready for him yet, basically, and that's why he's calling it for him. And I think it's also, again, Nietzsche being the influence, but Nietzsche was also a big influence, and possibly influenced by, I'm not sure of their entire relationship, Richard Wagner, who wrote the Nibelungenlied, the Ring of and the Valkyrie. Ring
of the Nibelung and Ride of the Valkyrie.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, yes, I'm getting it all jumbled up. But yes, the famous opera there. And the opera themes are, they were definitely, again, Wagner and Nietzsche knew each other, and he was inspired by a lot of the same ideas. And that's a story where, a Superman is created by, in this case, Wotan, the gods, to fulfill a purpose that he has in mind, which was to save them. And the guy he creates is kind of Siegfried, who's kind of the Germanic Hercules. He's too powerful to be controlled, essentially, and he's really dumb, and Wotan can't sort of control him the way he wants to, and he basically ends up destroying the spear of law that Wotan uses to rule, which is symbolic of him basically saying, I'm too strong, I'm too powerful, I'm not reined in by the will of the gods anymore. I'm the ubermensch that Nietzsche wrote about. And but then, of course, he ends in tragedy and sorrow, and it gets out of control because he can't... a lot of things happen that are kind of contrived in the opera, if you know it. Do you know it at all, Phil? Or?
Little. I mostly know the original Norse myths. So.
Right, the original operas. Anyway, he ends up taking a forgetfulness drug and some other stuff, which is a little hard to relate to direct consequence of his powers. But I feel like that was an inspiration for this story in many ways.
Makes sense.
Because it's also about the angst of the Superman and how the Superman doesn't fit in and how he's being manipulated by the gods and he breaks through the will of the gods. Because he says explicitly in this novel, he becomes an atheist pretty early on. He basically says, I don't believe in God. And then it ends, if you don't mind us spoiling it for you, it ends with him getting hit by lightning while sort of cursing God, which is a pretty hard to misinterpret moment. So he dies because the will of God's will is that he dies, apparently, after spending most of the things seeming like he's, against he's against the idea of conventional religious morality. It seems like God sort of steps in and goes, nope, I don't believe in that.
Yeah. Well, the ending has a meeting with a scientist who suggests that he build an entire race of other Supermen.
Right.
They use the word eugenics.
Right.
Outright. So it's a little problematic.
Yeah.
So he's considering this. He's going back and forth on whether they want to set up a new civilization in the jungles to basically eventually conquer mankind.
Yeah. Yeah, it's worth noting that the first few centuries of the first few decades of the 20th century, eugenics was a thing. It was a big idea. The idea of biological. It was
considered a progressive idea at the time. Like it was like
Margaret Sanger was
racism was just assumed, and this was sort of the we can fix it though.
Yeah.
Rather than we'll exterminate everybody. It's more of like a
eugenics basically boils down to we're going to biologically improve the human race, whether by just careful breeding or whether by
sterilization
sterilization of undesirables.
Yeah.
It gets creepy really fast.
Yes,
theoretically. As a basic idea, it doesn't have to be horrible, but it gets
always
horrible
is in practice
pretty fast. And of course, that's something the Nazis ran with, and it was big in the West. It wasn't like it was just the Nazis. Of course, the Doc Savage books, which we will talk about at some point, are basically eugenicist tracts. That's the basic idea. And again, Doc Savage doesn't have any special superpowers. Like he's not filled with special chemicals or anything. He just is trained to be the best of the best of the best of humanity.
Yeah.
It's sort of a vigorous program of improvement that turns
It's more like a Batman than a Superman.
That's right. But it's still clearly meant to have that sort of eugenicist thing. Speaking of Doc Savage, Philip Wylie wrote a book called The Savage Gentleman, which is about a guy, and it's so much like Doc Savage that it's absolutely astounding. It's a guy who's in the book, apparently. His dad went is a guy he's cheated on by his wife, I believe, and he decides women are all unfaithful. I'm going to raise my son away from the influence of women entirely, and he's going to become the greatest man possible because we're going to get him out of the influence of women. So he takes them off to some tropical island, and they create a utopian father-son society with no women, basically. Mm-hmm. And then, if I'm not mistaken, the novel is he goes back to society and has to learn to deal with women. I'm not 100% sure if Wylie was like approvingly of this, or if he was saying, no, this guy would be screwed up, and he would have to learn to deal with women properly.
Yeah,
right?
Wylie seemed to have some issues with women. At least. He wrote a book complaining about something he called momism,
right?
Which was sort of
that's the
coddling.
Savage Gentleman. Yes.
Yeah. No, this was another book.
Oh, okay.
Called Generation of Vipers.
Okay.
Which was a critique of American society, and he thought, what we now call the greatest generation, perhaps,
right.
But he complained about them as, a degenerate generation because of the way they were raised.
Right. Yeah.
Apparently, though, he wrote some other novels which were a little more less overtly misogynistic.
Yeah.
And his daughter said he wasn't a misogynist, like far from it. So.
Well, but it came up though.
It came up, yes.
Because you read this book too, and the female characters up until actually pretty much all of them have a lot of negative traits. His mom is terrible.
His mother is a religious fanatic,
right?
Who represses, basically bullies his father,
right?
And
is sort of the symbol of the superstitious past that he's breaking away from, basically.
Yeah.
And Abednego, his dad, actually says, "Well, what if I have a girl though, and then she'll be exactly like her mother?"
Yeah. The novel says he fears super strong women reformers.
Yeah, exactly. Somehow, if it was a woman, he knows exactly what their personality would be like.
Yeah.
And his dad's no great shakes either. He's kind of a wimp, and mere fact that he, and he experiments on his son. Although that's, I guess, not looked down on too much by Wylie.
Yeah,
but
it's not fully, because I told somebody that and they said that's creepy.
Yeah.
So in the modern context, it's definitely really creepy, but I think they didn't quite think through the implications of that.
No, he does. In the early going, he frames it as like, is this moral? Is this right to do? Like, so he obviously knew there was something off about it to an extent. But at the end of the day, he seems to think that's less a big deal than being really religious. But she's really bad because she's super religious, and she's his mean old mom who's really strict and wants to.
Yeah, he doesn't really relate to his mother. Like he does what she tells him to do, but the son. But he relates to his father, like he actually talks to him and reveals his secrets as he's...
Yeah. And even, and sort of on his deathbed, his dad goes, oh, yes, I created you. I thought you could do all this good for the world. It would be so great. And he's like, yeah, Dad, okay. But he's trying to be, he's kind of like, oh, I've let you down, Dad. Like, it's almost spelled out that way and not, you're a crazy person, Dad, who ruined my life. Which is what a normal person would be thinking at that point. And in fact, that supposedly inspires him to try and be better for a while, which doesn't succeed. But he at least tries after that.
Yeah.
Anyway. But yeah, the female characters in the book, and then although interestingly, he meets Charlotte, who's almost.
She's a first-time sex worker when he meets her.
Right.
She thinks that. He's going to pay for sex, but and this novel deals with sex explicitly, which is weird for the 30s. Like he loses his virginity in high school and all this, and it doesn't go the Man of Steel, Woman of Kleenex route, which is stupid.
No, I think I mean it's implied that like this guy, they make it pretty clear. For instance, the father experiments on a cat. And it's pretty clear he has to kill the cat with poison, I believe. So there's definitely things that could kill him that beyond, it's just blunt force trauma will not kill him, basically.
And at one point when he's in the war, a shell does burst and causes him to bleed.
Right.
Causes him to bleed, so.
And then his wounds heal really fast, too, right? Yeah, so it's but they don't imply, he's semi-invulnerable, but there are a lot of ways they could get him, apparently.
Yeah, and starvation, too. He does eat a lot.
Yeah, he eats a lot and he starves a lot at one point because he has no money. He does have morals. That's the thing. He's like, he refuses, he earns a father of a friend of his who's a scummy kind of banker, ends up offering it, like he takes his money and he ends up making $1 million out of it and going, here, you can have $1 million. I made a bunch of money off he's a war profiteer basically. And Hugo refuses to take the money because he
gives it to his parents.
He gives it to, sorry, you're right. He does take it. He gives it to his parents, but he refuses to use it for himself. Because he's a war profiteer. And then he does actually take some of the money later, but then it's like, I'm going to use it to do good.
But anyway, basically. Charlotte is sort of a low class, lower class as in economic class.
Yeah.
But she's treated very sympathetically, I thought.
Yeah, it was interesting because she's set up, and it's funny because she literally cheats on him with his best friend, and it's portrayed as a heroic thing. Yeah. Because it was like he loves her too much. He's not reaching his full potential. She knows that if he didn't have her, he could go on and do great things. She's like, okay, I'm going to run off with your best friend, and I'm going to treat you like a whole tart, but I'm only doing it for your own good, basically.
Yeah.
And it's framed, and they frame it that way explicitly. So that is really interesting. On paper, she's a heartless tart, and then you look at her motivations, and they're pretty carefully fleshed out as, no, she's doing it to help him, basically.
Yeah, and it's a very sympathetic. I mean, like I said, when he first meets her, she's planning on having sex for money, and she's treated sympathetically, which, once again, this is the 1930s.
It's 1930 was the novel actually came out.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that the 1920s, like, it's always been a bit of a pendulum, and the 1920s are actually, they were kind of a swinging era. There was actually a lot of looseness. If you've ever read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, it's from the same era. It deals with sex pretty openly, and there was more LGBT stuff at that time. They were starting, in the upper class at least, they were more willing to discuss that kind of thing. So there actually was a bit more of a loosening of morals right before the Depression. Then everything kind of got, the Hays Code came in.
Yeah.
If you've ever seen the original Tarzan movies, by the way, there were cuts where they were Jane was running around naked, basically. I don't know if you know that. Yep. And that's the kind of thing that made the Hays Code step in, basically.
Yeah. Speaking of movies,
yes.
this got one apparently.
Yes.
Wasn't able to track it down, but it's it's a comedy.
Yeah,
it's a very
that's
loose
the weird-
adaptation. The character's name is Hugo Kidd, I believe.
Okay.
And he gets like he's a weakling football player, and Dr. Danner, who's another character, not his father, gives him a serum that gives him temporary superhuman strength. So he enters a boxing competition for charity, but then loses his strength, so he has to cheat his way through.
Okay.
So that's the plot of the movie.
Yeah.
Nobody notable in it. So yeah, it's
that's so weird that they looked at this and went, a comedy, obviously.
Yeah. Like it's such a depressing book in some ways. So.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's true. That wouldn't have been raking in. That may be a big factor. You have to wonder if maybe Superman getting a better adaptation is what made it live in the public consciousness for years afterwards, as opposed to this never really taking off in terms of a spin-off. But it's true that Superman is, realizing the potential that Hugo never realizes.
Yeah.
That's literally the point of the book almost, is that he never realizes his potential.
Well, speaking of Superman, speaking of comics in general,
yes.
This was adapted a few times in comic books.
Yeah.
It was public domain almost as soon as it was released due to some issues.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly what happened, but sometimes copyrights are badly, the years are put down wrong or whatever. So Roy Thomas did an adaptation. He's a famous Bronze Age writer,
right?
In the 70s.
Yeah, he basically took over from Stan Lee at Marvel.
Yeah, and he was very obsessed with continuity issues. Fixing little mistakes in continuity, and very meticulous with that. And when DC was did the Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they merged Earth 1 and Earth 2. Earth 2 was where all the Golden Age World War II heroes were, and Superman was one of them, the Golden Age Superman. So when they merged the two universes together, the Superman was in the present day, so there's no Superman in the past, so they had nobody to fill that niche. So they created Roy Thomas created a character named Iron Monroe, who was actually Hugo Danner's son. So this book, Gladiator, was DC continuity from like 1986 to 2000, whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that he was faithful enough to the book to not just make it Hugo Danner.
Yeah.
Because that isn't really true to the character.
But also, the book explicitly says that his child would be normal.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, they kind of explicitly make it that, he wouldn't just have a kid who would have super strength. He'd have to give him this special formula. So that was apparently thrown out, but not the basic theme of the book.
Yeah, but it's interesting that...
Yeah.
And also apparently Howard Chaykin did one in the 90s where it was like the Vietnam War instead of World War I.
All right.
Anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, no, there was definitely, I think an even older Marvel, maybe that's the Chaykin one I'm thinking of, but I believe Marvel did reference it in like the 70s. They did like...
Yeah, the Marvel 70s one was called Man God. That was the Roy Thomas one.
Oh, okay. All right. So so that was in the Marvel universe?
Yeah, Roy Thomas did an adaptation for the Marvel universe, and then I used that to say Roy Thomas also did it in the DC universe.
So Roy Thomas really likes this book, apparently. Yeah. You referenced it twice. Okay, that's interesting. But yeah, that's... And
the Chaykin one was called Legends, I believe.
Right, okay. So yeah, it's definitely. I remember in Supreme, Alan Moore's book Supreme. He has the Kirby. I don't know if this is accurate to Kirby, but I mean Alan Moore did meet Kirby. But he has Kirby literally say, "Oh yeah, when you talk about a Superman type character, you call them a Wylie."
Oh okay.
In the
I'd forgotten that.
It kind of implied that the Golden Age type of artist, that's what they used to call them as shorthand. They call them Wileys. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's kind of how Moore frames it. But that would definitely, again, imply. So just to go back to the idea of Siegel and Schuster reading this book. So there's a large controversy over whether, there's something of a controversy over whether Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, Joe Siegel and Jerry Schuster, whether they had actually read this book. Because the thing is, it's very hard not to read it and think, oh yeah, Superman and Captain America. But there's no actual evidence that they ever did read it. However, they definitely read Doc Savage, because
Yeah.
if you know Doc Savage, his first name is Clark, and he has a Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to
in
avoid.
the Arctic, no less, or Antarctic, or
Yeah.
one of those.
No, I think Doc Savage is in the Arctic.
Okay.
Too. Yep, they're both in the Arctic. So, and Doc Savage is very clearly influenced by Wylie, both this book and The Savage Gentleman, as I already mentioned. So there is a transitive property here, which clearly makes him the grandfather of Superman, if not the father. So that's my stance on that. That, you know, whether he had specifically read it, and I really think he had, because I think it was a pretty popular novel at the time. I think it was pretty well known, at least certainly in nerd circles of the 1930s.
And there's a story that that Siegel wrote a positive review of the book, but that's apparently not true.
Saying. I did look at that, and somebody was saying, he listed off a lot of supposed connections, and he said apparently none of that is true. There is literally no specific evidence that they'd read it. It's just pretty obvious to me that they did. That's all. So you can't prove it 100%, but come on. Even if they didn't read it, they clearly read Doc Savage, which was inspired by this. So I think you can definitely call this firmly the forerunner of the superhero novel. I mean, superheroes, there's a lot of influences on superheroes. You could call Tarzan in many ways the first superhero. You could call Flash Gordon, and of course you can go back to like Robin Hood. You can go the Scarlet Pimpernel, because he has the secret identity, and
Sherlock Holmes has some elements.
Sherlock Holmes, there's a lot. So you kind of
like going back to Greek mythology, Heracles. And...
Sure, of course. Yeah, and Hercules, and I already mentioned Siegfried. All these characters, there's always a sort of... But I mean, on the modern era, that's where they synthesize a bunch of elements together to make Superman. The secret identity is kind of new. And there were characters before Superman who had secret identities, too. Like, that actually was a thing. But they combined it with, and he has superpowers. That was kind of the innovation of Superman.
And he fights crime.
Well, people who put on secret identities to fight crime existed before Superman, but they didn't necessarily have superpowers, that's all.
Yeah, so, and there were superpowered characters, like the Nyctalope, who can see in the dark, but he had no secret identity. It was just...
Exactly. Yeah, it's the combination of those two factors that is the innovation of Superman. And then, of course, there were a bunch of... like patriotic heroes. When you read the World War I segment of this novel, it's, of course, this was all written before World War II, but it's impossible not to see, Captain America in these stories because it's a superpowered
Though it's
soldier.
It's a lot more of a downer, because World War I in general is
right.
I mean, both wars were not.
Yeah, you're not like smash the Hun. Kaiser Wilhelm really had it coming. It's not. Yeah. It's hard to root for
even going in
that.
when he's really excited to enter the war when it starts, because it's just because he has so many destructive impulses and he wants to let loose.
Right. Exactly.
It's not because he really believes in the cause of World War I.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when they get to the end, and he basically, well, not at the end, even at the end of the war segment, he's kind of like, it's just a war of property against property. They start spouting pretty Marxist stuff as the series, as the
I couldn't find anything on Wylie's political beliefs, but the book seems vaguely Marxist.
It's very, at the very least, it's sympathetic to Marxism.
Yeah,
and that's actually something that I've been finding interesting. If you read about late 19th century socialism and up till the early 20th century, it's bound up with the idea of it's almost a science fictional aspect. A worship of science is part of it, just as much as we're going to better the lot of humanity via economics. It's also kind of there was a thing called Russian cosmism, where the guy you may have heard of, Tsiolkovsky, who wrote about we're going to build arcs to go to outer space and all kinds of crazy stuff like that, which very much influenced Lenin. Lenin was also influenced by a couple of arguably science fiction novels. You can argue whether they're science fiction or just sort of positing positive future. One especially called What Is to Be Done. And of course, he liked Gorky a lot. And I always find later, then you have people like Ayn Rand, who were essentially writing pulp novels, but they expected their philosophy to be taken super seriously, right? And so it's always interesting to me that there is actually this weird overlap with these various ideologies and almost a pulp sci-fi mentality. But you read, but there's definitely the socialist ideal of, we'll create a better man, the new
and also
society.
The idea of money being kind of, because he breaks with the communist godlike characters because they want to increase their revenue.
That's right. Well, yeah, the main reason he doesn't fall in with the communists is that they're revealed to be hypocrites, where they mostly care about making money for the cause, but still he's like, but we should do the right thing that will, this is helping.
Freeing political prisoners who are going to be executed.
Right. He said, he hatches a plan. They're going to free these people. And the guy eventually says, no, actually, it's better that they are in jail because that increases sympathy for our cause.
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah, but it's the right thing to do to break them out. And he says, oh, well, but no, we don't want to do this. You can't do it. And he goes, well, what if I paid you just as much money as you think you're making? And the guy's like, really? Oh, okay, that'd be great. And he's like, screw you, you're just in it for the money, basically. Or again, not literally the money, but so in a way it's not anti-communist, it's just saying, well, these guys, and that's almost a criticism of like, that is a common criticism of like Lenin and the Soviet Union, of just being like, they didn't ultimately stick to their principles because they were too obsessed with gaining power, which they said was for the revolution, but it's still, they betrayed their own principles. So it is very sympathetic in that sense to socialism, and it seems to be, and that was, remember, the 1920s and 1930s, socialism was a major movement in the U.S. Yeah. That was really popular. That would not have been a weird outlying philosophy for a lot of people.
And it wasn't as clamped down on as it became after the war.
Yeah. Well, it was, but
I mean, more than I do about this. So
there were literally communists running for government in the 20s and 30s, but then there were also people sending in the cops to break their heads, basically. So it's kind of, you're kind of right and you're kind of not right. But it's people tend to say FDR. He's one of the main guys who killed the movement towards socialism and communism, because not by cracking down on them, but by giving them some of what they wanted, basically. And that kind of killed everyone's, like, once you had all the socialist reforms within the non-socialist system, people stopped asking for, all the stuff that socialism was going to give them. And that kind of petered out, and it got transferred into labor movements and stuff like that. But it was a much, in the 20s and 30s, you're right, it was no big deal to be a socialist. Well, again, there were a lot of people who hated that, but it was a mainstream political viewpoint. Then as the 50s and 60s rolled on, it became, you must be an agent of the Soviet Union if you're a communist, right? So, but it is interesting that the book goes into that, and you almost don't expect it to go there, because most books back off from that these days. But this just goes full on, just like, communist. And in addition to showing them as hypocrites being their main criticism, he also makes it that they say they aren't communists at one point, which almost seems like he's exonerating communists. Did you notice that?
Yeah,
he goes, oh no, we have a higher goal than, he says higher goal than Bolshevism.
Yeah.
Which could be interpreted a few different ways, basically. But it almost seems like he's not trying to come down too hard on communism when he.
Speaking of that section, when he plans to better Washington by just threatening and beating up politicians he doesn't like.
Yeah, we were talking about Silver John last time, and he was going to head to Washington too. He was going to kick some ass in Washington. So that seems to be a common thread for some of these guys.
Yeah. Yeah, but in this case, it doesn't work out because it's Washington and nobody really believes crap. In the story, anyway.
I feel like, again, he says this about himself. Oh, I lack spirit and intelligence. And I do feel like he gives up way too easily. Hugo does. Superman would not give up this easily.
No.
Even if that was his goal, to beat politicians up until they did the right thing.
There's a section where he muses that he could fight crime or become a super detective.
Right. Yeah, he says that.
Yeah, like he uses pretty much those words, and he doesn't do that.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it is like the hints of the superhero novel are there. It just this novel chooses to go in another direction.
Yeah, exactly. It's so much like you would think this was written after superheroes had been a common thing. And
it feels like a Watchmen deconstruction thing.
Exactly. Like, what if a superhero decided not to become a superhero? But this is literally, it's probably more like Siegel and Schuster and read that and was, wait, what if he did become a super detective?
Yeah.
Like, that's a way more entertaining story. And they're right. It is a way more entertaining story.
Yep.
So,
I mean, there's a reason Superman has lasted, and Hugo Danner is just sort of, mentioned in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, it is interesting because this is a pulp podcast. We're talking about pulp. In some ways, it's not a pulp novel.
Yeah, it's a little too non-adventure based.
Yeah.
I think like there is fighting, there is World War II, there is does kill a guy, but it's.
Yeah, it's like a coming of age novel more than anything, or a slice of life.
Yeah, you mentioned
novel.
Hemingway. It feels very more like a literary novel with some sci-fi elements.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like a classic literary novel, either modern or in the past, where it's like, again, it's. Well, we got to keep away from the action adventure. He's never quite going to become an action adventure hero.
Mm-hmm. But it's so influential on pulps, I thought it would be an interesting thing to look at.
Oh yeah, and it's absolutely, because it's so influential. And I mean, Wylie Wylie also wrote When Worlds Collide, which is 100% a sci-fi pulp novel as well. I mean,
and apparently influenced Flash Gordon as well, right?
Yes, that was a big influence on Flash Gordon.
It seems Wylie was very influential on things that are more famous than anything he created.
yeah, it's true. Though they did make a movie out of When Worlds Collide. That's actually he's probably better known for that nowadays than he would be for Gladiator. But yeah, his concepts are clearly pulp adventure concepts. It's just that he takes them in a more literary direction, at least based on this novel he does, which is it's very interesting. But you could also argue that at the time they didn't necessarily expect every novel to be wall-to-wall action adventure. Yeah. Like there are definitely a lot of old sci-fi novels. Frankenstein's not a thrill a minute ride.
No.
So, there's a lot of these classic books are more literary in many ways as well. That's sort of what distinguished the pulps, is that they were, I guess, a bit more rip-roaring, and something's got to happen every chapter to punch through. But I mean, then you can go back to Charles Dickens, and he was a chapter author, chapter a month author, or whatever he wrote, chapter a week, whatever he wrote, how often his output was. But he was he's a literary author. You wouldn't call him a thrill-a-minute writer either. So there's a much blurrier line, I think, between the pulps and the literary offerings at that point. And as we discussed a couple shows ago, Anne Radcliffe, who's probably like a low-class goth writer, but she influenced Jane Austen, that kind of thing. So it is definitely interesting that there was possibly less divergence between the two, which is a theme I find interesting, and we'll probably discuss it in a future offering. But
this was definitely better than a Nyctalope novel.
Phil does not like the Nyctalope. We will talk about the Nyctalope someday.
Yeah. We'll get to that in another episode, but yeah.
Are you excited to hear about these really bad novels that Phil hates? Well, we're going to talk about them
eventually. He can see in the dark.
He can see in the dark. That's his superpower. Yep. So we'll get it someday. Anyway, but I think it's time for us to say goodbye, folks, again, for another couple of weeks. As always, we are Phil and Adam. Okay, so just a reminder, I am on Twitter as Prankster36. I have a Patreon. I have a number of comics, including Liberia and Night Beach, and I edit Strange Romance, which are all on Comixology. You can check out all my stuff on www.phantasmictalesph.com. And Phil also has stuff.
You can find me online as either Philip Rice or Spear Havoc. SPEARHAFOC _ on Twitter. It was taken. I have several comics as well, including the Apex Society, which is pulp themed. That's a web comic and also available on Comixology, and some other things available, including Halloween Girl. And I'm on Patreon as Philip Rice. I think it's also Spear Havoc there.
So, we'll say goodnight once again, all you adventure kids with your decoder rings and your secret masks. I don't know. I don't know what they did back in the pulp era, but they did. Anyway, good night again, folks. Take care.